I could see at least two teams missing out with a winning record: Houston and Kansas City.
Really, it's going to be a battle of the two offenses in this case. So I predict a high-scoring game.
This is what they get for firing Brian Flores. You remember that 2021 season when the Dolphins won 7 in a row with Brian Flores just to get booted out of the playoffs and then terminated on Black Monday. Why would they even do that?
Offseason in terms of talent-wise, when they got Tyreek Hill, so they had the right talent the following year. If they had that exact same offseason with Brian Flores as the coach, how much different would have it gone? I don't know if we necessarily would have been.
It would have been way different if Brian Flores.
It would have been better.
It would have been different with Brian Flores because he has a winning culture defense, but the offensive was pretty much god-awful.
Back in, like, say, Madden, the original Madden 25 franchise mode, it would have been generated during one of the off seasons. You get a random, like, Kurt Warner coming out of retirement or Ray Lewis coming out of retirement storyline. Good evening, everyone. It's another Tuesday prime time, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This time, we're here for a special edition of NFL Pick'ems because the regular season is over. And I'm joined by my co-host, Agent Warrior X. And it's funny because we had that intro with accurate takes because we had another take last week about the Steelers-Ravens game that ended up being accurate in regards to the losing team.
I kid you not, Nikki. Thank you for the introduction. And Happy New Year's, everyone, and sports fans. This is Agent Warrior X. And today, let's just say that this Black Monday just got real interesting. Because a couple of hours ago, the Baltimore Ravens has officially parted ways with John Harbaugh after 18 long years. Don't get me wrong. John Harbaugh is an excellent coach. And when people saw this, a lot of people were shocked, including myself. The game that got John Harbaugh fired was using Tyler Loop in that game against the Steelers. I think a lot of people don't want him gone because he has a great tender of developing Lamar Jackson, and he has a great running back of Derrick Henry. But ultimately, when John Harbaugh was terminated, Judgment Day for the Baltimore Ravens.
You're right.
Sorry, Judgment Day for the Baltimore Ravens has officially arrived.
No, it comes a point where they say all good things must come to an end. And in John Harbaugh's case, you're talking about the greatest coach in Baltimore Ravens franchise history, A. B, the longest tenured coach, which also equates to the most regular season wins, most playoff appearances, has a Super Bowl win on his resume. But it got to the point where it seemed like in recent years, it really started around 2021 that you started to see the first, kind of the beginning of the end. In hindsight, they had that season where, granted, they got hit with injuries and they collapsed, but they had injuries, they get the benefit of the doubt. The next year, they sneak in the playoffs, lose to the Bengals, but then all of a sudden, Lamar is a full season healthy. He wins MVP. They go to the conference championship game. They get some benefit of the doubt. Then last year, they win the division, but flame out against Buffalo. This year was a huge year of what could have been for the Ravens, even with Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry. It just felt like the biggest problem was blown leads, particularly two of them, against the Patriots and the Bills. If you reverse the outcome of those games, they win the division in that case. So it's more than just blaming your kicker for missing a field goal. There's a lot of other things that went wrong along the way as well. It just seems like with Harbaugh, despite his brilliance, he did have a tendency for blowing late leads even before this season, and it really caught them this year, so they just decided it was time to part ways. It happens. Remember Belichick, the greatest coach in Patriots history?
Bill Belichick was the most tenured. By the way, my dad said this. Tomlin was the most tenured coach. I agree with that since 2009, and ever since then, they only made it to one AFC championship. And by the way, I said it a while back to say that the Steelers are more comparable to the Yankees because they haven't made it to the World Series in over 15 plus years until last season, until 2 years ago. Same with the Pittsburgh Steelers. They made it to the AFC Championship, but ultimately losing to the I think it was the I think it was the Patriots. And ultimately for them, since then, Mike Tomlin is easily the best coach to tender with. For John Harbaugh, there are three teams that I have on this case in terms of hiring head coaches. One, the Giants. Here's why. He's a perfect fit for Jackson Dart's development. He did the same situation with Joe Flacco making him an MVP back in 2012. He did the same thing with Lamar Jackson, and he made them a serious playoff contender. If Joe Schoen makes the right moves, guess what? You have a running back to work with. If Cam Scottaboo, you have a receiver Malik Neighbors who's coming back healthy later this year, and you have a promising quarterback future of Jackson Dart. If only the Giants play their cards right in terms of hiring the right coaches, they got a shot at going to the Super Bowl and competing with the Philadelphia Eagles.
And with Harbaugh, the big question is, does he still have the desire to coach? Because if he does, there's going to be several teams looking to interview him. He's going to have several offers on the tables because there were teams that did fire their coach on Black Monday yesterday, where their fan bases and even some of the owners would love to have John Harbaugh as the coach if they have the opportunity to do so. The Giants being one of them. Hell,
I also mentioned the Atlanta Falcons because you called it a while back last week. You said Rasheed Morris should be the next coach terminated, which you actually was right about that. And they just fired their GM while they were at it. So I don't know, because considering you already have Kirk Cousins on your team, but I don't think so. You already have Bijan Robinson. You have a good receiver of Drake London, and that's pretty much it. So I do not know about the Falcons hiring John Harbaugh. And the third team I'm going to mention is the Cleveland Browns. No, the Cleveland Browns will potentially ruin a power-hungry Shedeur Sanders. I don't see that happening. But I do see, however, if the Giants hire the right move and they do the right thing in terms of hiring John Harbaugh, they got a shot of making to the Super Bowl and potentially win the NFC East for years to come. If they have the right pieces, the right coordinators, you have a shot of winning the NFC East and potentially going to the Super Bowl for years to come. So let's see how this plays out for the next couple of days. And by the way, my dad also said Shane needs to go. I agree.
Yes, and it's going to be, it's all going to depend on, does Harbaugh want to take a year off and then come back, or does he just want to dive right into his road to redemption, get hired by a team, and start fresh? Because if he wants to do that, he's going to be several offers on the table. It's just a matter of Harbaugh evaluating his offers and deciding what would be the best spot for him if he wants to get right back into the game of coaching.
Like the Patriots, what they did with Jerod Mayo back 2 years ago, after they fired him one season, and then they hired Mike Vrabel. They did the same thing with Mike Vrabel. After being a advisor for the Browns, he then ends up being on the Patriots head coach, and look where it got them: an AFC East title and a potential playoff home field advantage. Same thing with the Chargers. They fired Brandon Staley and they fired Tom Telesco. They did the same thing with that, and they hired Jim Harbaugh from the Michigan Wolverines, which, by the way, that was really a good hire for the Chargers. If the Giants decide to do the same thing to interview John Harbaugh, that's it. The Giants now got a good coach to work with. You'll get the right pieces to work with, and potentially you'll get an offensive defensive coordinator, if you have in mind, with either Cliff Kingsbury or someone who has a really good track record of top 5 or top 10 offenses in the league throughout the years.
But that's going to be the big story outside of the playoffs because, and there's going to be a bunch of openings now too. And it feels appropriate that we also at least touch up on Black Friday, on Black Monday in and of itself, along with the John Harbaugh news. So, it's kind of one of those thank you for your services, best luck in your future endeavors. And now we got to add the Ravens to discussion for potential coaches to go for because who knows, maybe they just need a fresh voice in the locker room. Sometimes it happens, even with the best coaches.
Yep, I'm gonna give you a prime example for best coaches who got terminated for a long year tender. Pete Carroll when he was on the Seahawks when he won a Super Bowl. I can name Andy Reid eventually. I could name Andy Reid too. I can name John Harbaugh. I can name Jim Harbaugh also from the 49ers before he parted ways.
That was more of a power struggle.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Power struggle. Mike Vrabel also did the same thing with the Titans. I still don't think the Titans should definitely hire Jason Garrett because that will be an awful hire.
Yeah, I don't see what the real appeal with Jason Garrett was. And he kind of held that Cowboys team back that had a talented roster. And speaking of that, I think that ties into Pete Carroll, who really, now that we think about it, seeing what the Seahawks have done this year, I think Pete Carroll was actually holding the Seahawks back the last couple years he was there, despite being on the cusp of the playoffs several times. Now you see what they've done, new coach, new voice. They got home field advantage entering the playoffs. And you see what Pete Carroll did with the worst team around him with the Raiders. 1 year, they axed him after that.
I kid you not. That was a great statement you pointed out because I was thinking Pete Carroll was the problem in Seattle, but ultimately for Sam Darnold to do a lot better, I think, in my perspective, now they have the first seed in the NFC and the home field advantage. I think we could witness something what we saw back the last decade with the Seahawks with Pete Carroll and the Legion of Boom. But the only difference is that the offense is still the best.
And it's amazing all of a sudden to see just 1 year makes us such a huge difference. At the time, some of us thought the Seahawks, it seemed like Sammy D, aka Sam Darnold, was going to a worse situation in Seattle, but turns out it was actually a great situation for him. He had the right talent around him. You got an excellent 1-2 duo at running back. You got a top receiver, and you got a really good defense as well over there in Seattle. So ultimately, Seahawks are in a great position, but the Raiders, man, they've botched so many times over the years with coaching hires. Bringing back
I think hiring Tom Telesco really was a mistake, and so was Antonio Pierce. Don't get me wrong, Antonio Pierce is a great defensive coordinator at best. He's more like Freddie Kitchens with vibes. But when you decided to have run the offense with Luke Getsy, Pierce more than likely lost the plot. He went from smoking cigars in the locker room to being smoked by real teams, including the Chiefs. But however, I still want him on the Giants as a defensive coordinator.
And I can't believe those speaking. What shocked me the most is that the Cincinnati Bengals made a statement. They're sticking by Zach Taylor. This reminds me of the Marvin Lewis saga all over again about how the owner, Mike Brown, was loyal to Marvin Lewis, even though he was proven to be a mediocre head coach. They gave him
and during that time, Andy Dalton was terrible on that Cincinnati Bengals team. 16 years of nothing but playoff utilities and an inability to control his players. And it took him this long to fire him, ultimately finding the right coach. And Zach Taylor should have been gone a long time ago. I think the Cincinnati Bengals are going to repeat what they did a 2 decades ago, what they did with Marvin Lewis. And my God, if the Bengals doesn't do the right thing in terms of firing Zach Taylor next year, they I don't know what to tell you in terms of wasting Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase's career.
Unbelievable. There's an old saying about insanity is doing the same thing, expecting a different outcome. And it looks like the Cincinnati Bengals are doing the same thing in regards to managing head coach that they did in the past with Marvin Lewis. And it's probably going to produce the same outcome. Mediocrity at best. And it'll look back historically as what could have been.
Yep. And I'm being honest with you, sure the Giants may have fired their coaches due to lack of talent, but at the same time, what could have been this whole year with the Lions, Cowboys, Broncos, 49ers, you can name every team that we played this year and we could have been in the playoffs. But ultimately, this clown defensive coordinator, Shane Bowen, has officially ruined a power-hungry Abdul Carter and making the defense look god-awful in second-half situations. So my thing is this. If they hire the right defensive coordinator, you could still have Dexter Lawrence doing his part. You have Kayvon Thibodeau entering free agency, and potentially you could do what needs to be best. Speaking of doing what needs to be best, the Commanders, I think getting rid of Cliff Kingsbury was a big mistake. Sure, he made the team go back to the NFC Championship for the first time in 30 plus years, but Cliff Kingsbury, if you see him on Arizona, he was terrible. Sure, he may have got multiple winning seasons, but eventually, after that, over time, it was due to lack of talent and still predictably failed, even though he was part of the Texas Tech team who failed in college and get fired for it, who ultimately failed as a head coach and get fired for it. I think, in my perspective, the only thing that I want to see at Cliff Kingsbury is a decent offensive coordinator at best when it comes to teams that wants to hire him. Nothing more than losing the locker room respect and moreover to have multiple second half season collapses. No one wants that, especially for teams that wants to contend to. They did the same thing with Kyler Murray, and now look at them. Ever since he's hurt, Jacoby Brissett is not doing very well.
And speaking of the Cardinals, let's just put it this way. Jonathan Gannon was a questionable hire from the beginning. He got the job because the Philadelphia Eagles were fresh off a Super Bowl run. He was the defensive coordinator. But a lot of people, including us as Eagles fans, said that Jonathan Gannon being the defensive coordinator was the weak link of that team and their undoing in Super Bowl 57. And when you look back on it, they got Vic Fangio. When they returned to the Super Bowl, they had a phenomenal defense, which has crossed over into this year. The point being is Jonathan Gannon really was an overrated defensive coordinator, number one. And they expected this guy to be their head coach. Well, look how that worked out. His highlight was winning against the Eagles at Lincoln Financial Field, New Year's Eve, his first season as the coach. That was really his highlight. Even last year off an easy schedule, when they had a shot at the division, they found a way to blow it. Because I remember the first half of the season, they looked like they were in contention with the 49ers injured, Rams injured, Seahawks be underachieving. And then on the second half of the season with a supposedly easier schedule, they did a complete 180 in the opposite direction and missed out on the playoffs.
This is exactly why I said the Cardinals are the most incompetent NFC West team ever since they moved out of the East. Ever since then, they only made one Super Bowl appearance in 2009, ultimately losing to the Steelers team with Big Ben and Mike Tomlin. Since then, the Cardinals only won a few playoff games, and none of them has officially gone better since. And I think you're right about Jonathan Gannon. When he was on the Cardinals on a couple years ago, he actually did pretty solid, but missing the playoffs with an injured Rams team and potentially a 49ers team, they have officially did a 180, which is the exact opposite. And I think they are officially wasting Marvin Harrison Jr.'s career. Don't get me wrong. Marvin Harrison Jr. is the best receiver since his father. If they play their cards right, and they trade Kyler Murray before the draft, that would be the best way to describe it.
And the way it's going right now, it looks like they're going to waste Marvin Harrison Jr.'s career. People say that Larry Fitzgerald's career was wasted, but at least Fitzgerald got to start in a Super Bowl and started in 2 conference championship games. So he at least has that on his resume. With Marvin Harrison Jr., it doesn't look like he's going to get to that level unless he goes to a new team, because the Cardinals are – is dysfunctional even the correct word? I know they seemed dysfunctional in the mid-2000s. Then they kind of got lucky with that Super Bowl run, but I don't know if that's going to happen again out of nowhere where they just get lucky to make a run. So,
speaking of lucky teams, we do not know how this will turn out when it comes to the playoff time in the next couple days. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, the hot takes are officially here. Let's get on to the first playoff matchup.
All right, let's start with it. So it's interesting. We had the Carolina Panthers win the NFC South as a mediocre team that, to be fair, they did improve upon their last 2 seasons, but they're still just a mediocre team that won a weak division. Now they're hosting the Los Angeles Rams. The Rams are favorites by 10 points, which I do understand why the Rams are favorite in a playoff environment, but I think 10 points is a little overzealous considering the Panthers did beat them during the regular season. So, might not be a complete landslide.
I kid you not. When it comes to teams like these, when it comes to teams that hasn't won championship divisions in a decade, between the Carolina Panthers with a losing record versus the Los Angeles Rams with a winning record, Matt Stafford is showcasing why he's the MVP this year. Carolina is proving that they are young, power hungry with T-Mac, Bryce Young, and Rico Dottle. I think they will have a great run, but at least they're in the playoffs. So
breaking up.
Sorry.
One moment, folks.
All right, so you can hear me good, right? Nope.
It's like
check. Yep, you can hear me good, right?
It's a little low, but I can hear you.
Oh, geez, I hate difficult. All right, there we go. I hate technical difficulties like this. Carolina with a losing record, I think at least they're here. So give me the Rams over the Panthers, because in my perspective, I think.
And I say this, the Carolina Panthers, to their credit, have turned this around. And they are a pretty solid defense, particularly they have an underrated secondary. And we saw they picked off Matthew Stafford, what was it, 3 times in that game, regular season game. But now, come playoff time, it's a little bit of a different story now, because now if you're the Panthers, you're going from being a pretty solid pass defense to going against the Rams come playoff time. Remember, the Rams with Coach McVay and with Matthew Stafford have been on this stage and have performed. Sean McVay, 2 Super Bowl appearances, a Super Bowl win. Matthew Stafford was there for that win under Coach McVay's tenure with the Rams. They've been to the playoffs 4 out of the 5 seasons Stafford has been there. They've had a winning record all but 1 season with McVay. So this unit is used to this situation. The Panthers haven't been to the playoffs since 2017, and this is a mostly young roster. So there are a lot of them, it's their first time under this type of pressure. It'll be interesting to see how they can perform under this stage. Now, granted, being in front of their home crowd helps, but ultimately the Rams being the better team, but having been a team that's been to the playoffs before, I got them getting the win. I could see maybe the first half, it's a competitive game, then the Rams experience catches up to them in the second half and they walk away with the game.
Which I agree with you. I couldn't agree more with you on that one, because of the fact that if they play their cards right, If the Rams play the cards right, they have a shot to go back to the Super Bowl for the first time in 4 years.
And remember, the Rams were last year. The Eagles run to the Super Bowl last year when they won it. If you ask who was the toughest game the Eagles played on that road, it was the Rams in the divisional round in the snow, where you thought the Rams would be at their biggest discomfort. The Rams almost beat the Eagles. So that goes to show you there that they're a resilient team.
Which is why I say that, in my perspective, I think if the Rams play their cards right, they have a shot to go back. Next matchup, we got the Chicago Bears versus the Green Bay Packers on Amazon Prime Video. I think the Bears, now it's their time. It's their time to shine, to go back to the NFC Championship if they play their cards right. Ben Johnson has showcased why he's head coach of the year. While the Packers, this is the same situation we had back 3 years ago with the Giants tying up the game against the Commanders, which, by the way, that should have never been in the tie. It should be either the Giants or the Commanders going back to the playoffs. But ultimately, the Commanders lost out, and I think the Giants won out, and they won a playoff game against the Vikings. But this time around, I got the Bears winning because Caleb Williams could still do their part, and the defense is still elite.
And this is a much different situation, too, because you're talking about a Minnesota Vikings team that had a good roster and a solid coach in Kevin O'Connell, but didn't really have a true quarterback in Kirk Cousins, who was a good game manager, but not the guy you rely on in clutch situations. And that's what cost them. In this case, you got Caleb Williams, who's really stepped up and had a phenomenal year, including, even though they lost against the 49ers, they put up a valiant fight in that game. While the Packers have been collapsing. Now, I'm not going to count the Vikings game because the Packers were sitting their starters. But you look at the Broncos game, you see, what game was it that they lost? Not week 18.
It was against the Chargers.
Yep. There was that game, week 17. You could see cracks starting to form in the Packers, which knocked them down to the 7th seed. So while they have a good roster, though, it's the Bears' time. They're just playing excellent football. Caleb Williams is coming to his own. This defense has really stepped up. Now, the big question is, what about CJ Gardner-Johnson? But even if he doesn't play, remember, Packers are handicapped. They don't got Micah Parsons. That defense looks like an entirely different defense without him.
Which is why I say that the Bears would definitely go back to the NFC Championship for the first time in over nearly a decade. And that double doink really broke them real hard. But at this time around, it's a completely different story. And then Sunday's game, we got the Buffalo Bills versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Keep in mind, the Buffalo Bills are 0-2 against the Jacksonville Jaguars when Tyrod Taylor was running the team. This time it's a completely different team. You have Josh Allen. You have David Cook. You have every single player, including Keon Coleman and Damar Hamlin. But going up against Trevor Lawrence with Travis Etienne, Tutin, and, of course, Evan Ingram, who was on the Broncos, by the way, I could see this as a shootout. But ultimately, the winner of that will be the Bills to snap their 2-game losing streak in the playoffs against the Jacksonville Jaguars.
And it's interesting you brought up the previous time these two teams met in the playoffs, because that was an entirely different situation. That was a Jaguars team that took advantage of a Colts without Andrew Luck, Texans without Deshaun Watson before his fall off. And then you had the Bills, who snuck in the playoffs on a tiebreaker with several teams. This time around, because that game was a low-scoring, kind of a boring game, this time around you actually got Trevor Lawrence played his best season this year under Liam Cohen. Travis Etienne, a good season. Josh Hines-Allen leading the way in sacks. The Bills still doing their thing. And not to mention, you got, for people that say Josh Allen doesn't have help, have you seen Cook run the ball? Actually, the Bills are the best ranked rushing team between Cook and Allen, and they're going against the top-ranked run team, if I'm not mistaken. So that's going to be an interesting matchup. And on the flip side, the Bills are the best pass defense headed into this one based off the way they played recent weeks. So that's going to be interesting right there. But
Which I kid you not, I think the Bills would win this one to snap their losing streak so that way Josh Allen can move on to the next round.
And I say that too because while the Jaguars have put together an impressive run, and while their run defense is good, I look at the teams they played. They have played some pretty solid, they beat the 49ers early in the season, and that was their best win. But they've also struggled a little. They did struggle against Houston in the rematch, and they haven't played a lot of. Remember they struggled against the Rams too. Matthew Stafford had a field day against them. And they haven't played against really a run team as good as Buffalo's run team. So I don't know how that run defense is going to hold up. So I think the Bills, having been in the playoffs before, having played the tougher schedule, got the advantage over the Jags in this one.
Which is why I think Trevor Lawrence will maybe having another playoff win if they continue to run the AFC South for years to come. But I think Travis Hunter should come back healthy and help out Trevor Lawrence to win multiple divisions. Next game, 49ers versus Eagles.
An interesting point before we move on. I will say this. A funny thing about the Bills, it's official. The Jets are the only team with 0 interceptions in a season. It's official. And secondly, the Jaguars have been in this situation before where they seemingly were against the Patriots back in 2005 when the Patriots had a little bit of a cool down after 3 Super Bowl wins. Jags had 12 wins. They seemed like the better team, but the Patriots had the harder schedule and they got exposed against New England in that game. I could see, maybe not to that level, but I could see something similar happening here. Well, the Jags are a good team. I just think the Bills are the better team in this situation.
Next up, you have the Philadelphia Eagles versus the San Francisco 49ers. Well, the 49ers are the most injured team in the league. What's there to expect? Sure, they finally made back to the playoffs after a long list of injured teams. But I think, in my opinion, this could be an exact opposite situation. The Philadelphia Eagles, the offense played mediocre. Especially with having your backup quarterback against the Commanders last on Sunday. Considering that versus the 49ers defense, I could see this playing out as a close matchup. But ultimately, I think the Pennsylvania BS might live on. Eagles over 49ers.
I could see
Psych 49ers over Eagles.
This is the one game I could see going either way. It's going to depend on one main factor. I think it's going to come down to late in the game because we've noticed a trend with the Eagles. Excellent defense and offense being handicapped by poor play designs by Kevin Patullo. And I'll say this, Nick Sirianni, he's best as a head coach when he's not the one calling plays and he has a competent mind calling plays for him. We saw that last year. We see how much they miss Kellen Moore as a play caller. As a coach, I'll give Kellen Moore another year at the Saints, see what he can do, but back to the Eagles. So I think with that, it's going to come down to late in the game. I think Eagles will probably have the lead. It'll come down to can their defense hold on? Because we saw against Buffalo, it almost cost them. I'm not really going to count the Washington game because both teams really – Washington was injured. Eagles really weren't playing for anything in that game. So the last real game I'm going to count is the Buffalo game. And we saw how that cost them against the Cowboys. Their defense finally got tired of having to play most of the snaps, and they got burnt out. It happened against the Broncos too. So it could be that here against the 49ers because the Eagles are the worst. They're one of the worst third down teams in the NFL despite winning their division. And if the defense has to continue to step on the field, it might cost them in the end.
You forgot to mention, hold on, my mic's messed. Okay, there we go. You forgot to mention that Christian McCaffrey is the only reliable source alongside George Kittle. The reason why I picked the 49ers over the Eagles is because they have a slighter advantage in terms of the offense. Eagles may have a good defense, but defense does win championship games. But when you have a piss poor offensive game, I don't think so. And I say the 49ers will move on over the Philadelphia Eagles because they have a slight advantage in terms of the offense and a slightly good passing defense.
Yeah, so I think it's probably going to come down to late in the game, but I could see the Eagles defense doing excellent for about 3 quarters. Fourth quarter, final drive, Niners are probably going to have the ball down by a close score. They'll probably at least get in position to score. Maybe the Eagles defense might get lucky, but I could see the Niners scoring and winning late in a close game because the Eagles offense, and they haven't been competent all season long. It could just be one of those situations the Niners win in the end in a close battle.
You should have never lost to the Giants, and you should have never lost to the Broncos. If Kevin Patullo would have played his cards right and you didn't vouch for a rat, you would have never been in that situation. You would have had home field advantage. But no, you had to squander too many games, especially that game on Black Friday. So it would have been possible if the Eagles got the first seed instead of just choking too damn much. Next game, Chargers versus Patriots. The Chargers, well, Jim Harbaugh, as I mentioned earlier in the show, I said Jim Harbaugh is a great coach out of the Michigan Wolverines, ultimately leading Justin Herbert to go back to the playoffs, but the Texans defense was too strong. Sure, you have Lad McConkey and you have Justin Herbert doing his part, but I think the defense is kind of concerning. Considering going up against the Patriots, a resurgence Patriots with Mike Vrabel and Drake May, Stephon Diggs, and Christian Gonzalez, I don't see that happening. The Patriots will move on. Enough said.
Yeah, I feel like this is pretty straightforward because while the Chargers do have a good team, another big factor you got to consider, it's in Foxborough, which is a tough stadium to play. And for the Chargers who play out west in a dome, they're traveling to the East Coast near Boston where temperatures are supposed to be in the 30s come Sunday. So that's going to put the Chargers in a tough spot. So I got the Patriots winning this one and moving on to the next round. Better luck next year, Chargers.
Hey, they did the same situation like they did with Jim Harbaugh when they were in the playoffs against the Texans, and now you finally got a chance to go back to the playoffs and maybe potentially do upset, but not by a long shot. You're still a playoff contender, but well within Super Bowl range. And then the final game on Monday night, we have the Houston Texans versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, the new AFC North champions. Mike Tomlin is an absolute genius, but when it comes to teams like these, this is the same situation they did against the Chiefs. But I don't know if TJ Watt could do his part in terms of the defense against that elite defense Texans team. If CJ Stroud can play his cards right, Nico
Collins.
Thank you, Nico Collins. Nico Collins could do his part, and so is Jake Ferguson, and all those players they have on that Texans offense. I could see this holding out at the end. If I had to choose one, it's going to come down to a field goal, and it's going to be the Steelers. I think the Steelers can move on for the first time in nearly over a decade if they play their cards right. Steelers over Texans.
This is an interesting matchup. I think if you're a fan of low scoring, coming down to the climax type of games, then I feel like this is going to be the game for you because we know the Pittsburgh Steelers with TJ Watt, the MVP of the defense, who's been that way throughout the entire first half of the 2020s. Now, you got the Texans, though, are a really good defense, too. Let's not forget. Remember, they held the Chargers to under 20 points just a few weeks ago, as one example. See how they managed to hold off Kansas City before Mahomes' injury and held and caught him multiple picks on him. Yeah, this defense can make some noise. So I think it's going to mostly be a battle there. And Rodgers, while he's played better individually than Stroud this season, which I'll say this, if this is Rodgers' farewell tour, regardless of what happens in the playoffs, certainly better way to go out than it was with that season with the Jets. So at least, but I think Rodgers at times has struggled, like against the Packers. Mind you, Micah Parsons was healthy. Mind you, against the Browns, who are not a good team, but with Myles Garrett, the now single-season sack record holder, they struggle to get going offensively. So
I kid you not. I kid you not. The same situation with the Steelers with Ben Roethlisberger back in 2021 will be the exact situation with the Steelers. If Mike Tomlin plays his cards right, they have a shot to go back to the AFC Championship, and hopefully they can get the job done. So I got the Steelers winning it because I want Aaron Rodgers to go out as a champion like Peyton Manning did. And also Ray Lewis. Don't forget Ray Lewis also went out a champion.
And then you also include John Elway as well.
Michael Strahan.
Right, and I'm sure there are others I can't think of right off the top of my head at this moment, but there are definitely others out there. Jerome Bettis.
Him too. Born and raised in Detroit.
Speaking of Pittsburgh, but I got the Texans winning this game. I mean, it's going to be a close game either way, but I think the Texans are just a little bit better than the Steelers. And I think once again that lack of having a true franchise quarterback, because Aaron Rodgers, while he's still good, he's not in his peak anymore, and he's not a true franchise quarterback. So they got the franchise guy at the wrong stage in his career in terms of being a Super Bowl team. So I feel like that's the part that's going to cost them here. And the Texans keep that momentum going another week.
And you know what? Since then, now that the wild card division is out of the way, let's take over our hot takes. So this is my first hot take. The San Francisco 49ers will outscore the Philadelphia Eagles 15 to 3. And reason why I say that is because the fact that the 49ers, have you been seeing the 49ers be playing well lately for the past couple games, especially that Monday night game against the Colts? That was amazing. And not only that, if the Eagles lose to the 49ers, that's it. They have to at least address the offensive coordinator situation. You can keep Vic Fangio because he's actually a really defensive mindset. Nick Sirianni is a questionable thing because if Nick Sirianni wants to defend his coordinators, I don't think so. You have to do what's right, what's best for your organization. And what's best for your organization is pretty much part of ways with that coordinator. Meanwhile, the Texans all season has been ranked the best defensive team in the league. And I said it, defense wins championships. Look what happened with the New York Giants back in 2007 when we played against the Buccaneers back in 2007. We played that team, and guess what? We won. We played against the NFC East champion Cowboys before they moved to AT&T Stadium in 2009. We beat Tony Romo in his final year, and look how that turned out in the NFC Championship. We always know how to beat the Packers when it comes to the NFC Championships or divisional round. Ultimately, Brett Favre fumbled at the worst time or got picked off. Ultimately, for the Giants going to the Super Bowl for the first time since 2001. And you remember what happened last time the Giants made it to the Super Bowl back in 2001? They lost to the Ravens, which, by the way, that Ravens team offensively was overrated. The defense, however, was carrying the team with Ray Lewis. Don't get me wrong.
Like the last really great defense to carry a team to a championship.
Kerry Collins was one of the best quarterbacks for the Panthers and Giants. He wasn't great, but he was actually one of the few good quarterbacks to work with. But when the Giants game against the Patriots back in 07 was the greatest Super Bowl of all time. If you had to choose between one Super Bowl that was great, the Giants and Patriots was a prime example. And I'm talking about the 2007 game against the Giants and Patriots. It's one of the most historic football franchises in the National Football League. They competed twice in the Super Bowl, 2007 and 2011, as Eli Manning was the only quarterback to dethrone Tom Brady 2 times in the Super Bowl. And that 2007-2011 Super Bowl team was carried by the defense itself.
Yeah, and Kerry Collins, I've always felt he was kind of a streaky quarterback. He had his good stretches, but he never was consistent enough to be the true face of a franchise. That's why eventually his tenure with the Panthers ended. Well, there was that, and there was another incident that played a role in that too, with him, I think, and Musa Muhammad. And then there were Giants. He had that one hot season, came crashing down the Super Bowl, had a subpar year the following year. 2002 was decent. Then in 2003, he completely did a 180, and that's when they knew they needed to replace him. And I remember with the Titans, he had one really good regular season, and that was like his the last good season he had. After that, he was done as far as being a serious
Speaking of the Titans, if I had to choose another good memory for the wild card or playoffs throughout the entire NFL history, it has to be the Music City Miracle back in '99. That was one of the greatest plays we've ever seen against Buffalo. And I kid you not, that Titans team back in '99 was one of the few greatest underdog stories, ultimately falling short to the St. Louis Rams.
The ultimate underdog story, who entering the season were stuck with former Arena Football League MVP Kurt Warner. Everyone thought there's no way it would translate over to the NFL. And the Rams went on to get home field in the NFC and win the Super Bowl with Warner being the MVP.
And that's why they call it the greatest show on turf, because you had Kurt Warner, you had Marshall Faulk, you had all these offensive players on that team. Another great memory for the playoffs and Super Bowl. Yes, I'm going to say it. The Saints and Vikings, Stephon Diggs clutch touchdown. That was by far the greatest play we've ever seen in our entire lives. When Stephon Diggs went to the end zone, I thought Drew Brees was going to have his last run with the Saints, but ultimately they came up short thanks to one man, Stephon Diggs.
And the irony is, I remember on like Christmas Day 2019, they had like the 100 greatest NFL games. Like it was like a documentary on NFL Network. They talked about that game and they interviewed Erin Andrews. She said that she was being told through her earpiece, once the final play's over, we're going to have you interview Brees, assuming that the Saints were going to win the game. And then all of a sudden the miracle happened. So much for that plan. Everything changed. But you know what else? Speaking of Saints and Vikings, the New Orleans Saints revenge story from Hurricane Katrina comes complete in the 2009 season. They get home field advantage, beat the Brett Favre, Adrian Peterson Vikings in the NFC Championship game, and then defeat the Peyton Manning-led Colts in the Super Bowl.
That was by far one of the greatest things they've ever done, and by far the greatest career that Sean Payton and Drew Brees had in their careers. Ultimately, for Drew Brees, he's considered one of the few good quarterbacks, while Sean Payton, by the way, is a head coach genius for the Broncos currently because he did the same thing with the Saints. But in my perspective, if I had to choose the greatest Super Bowl play of all time, and no, it's not the Philly special, it's the helmet catch. The helmet catch in 2007 was by far the greatest play of all time. 1 in a million shot that Eli Manning should have been tackled a long time ago, but ultimately David Tyree made one of the greatest catches of all time. And I kid you not, one of my coworkers told me that they were 1 second away from blowing the play dead. If that play was dead, this would have never happened. We lost to the Patriots.
Yep, that was just it's like, hey, David Tyree will always be remembered for that one moment. And then, of course, now, I would say Nick Foles, but technically he's remembered for two things. 2013 season, he got him to the playoffs. Then when he filled in as the backup, he won the MVP for Super Bowl 52, which will probably could be the last time we see a journeyman backup lead a team to a Super Bowl win. Because it's unlikely that's going to happen, at least for a while.
If you want to talk about good backup quarterbacks leading to Super Bowls, Nick Foles.
You're breaking up.
If you want to talk about best backup quarterbacks for Super Bowl runs, Nick Foles is one of them. Nick Foles is one of them. And you know who's also another one? Frank Wright. That one comeback against the Houston Oilers, ultimately leading that Bills defense to a Super Bowl championship, but ultimately losing all three teams, such as the Giants with Lawrence Taylor was still in his prime, the Washington Redskins, who eventually got the championship with the Commanders, and since then they have not made it to the Super Bowl since. And of course, the Dallas Cowboys. How can I not forget about that Dallas defense and the offense with Emmitt Smith and Troy Aikman?
And speaking of playoff memories, the NFC between the mid 80s to the late 90s, until John Elway's Denver Broncos finally got over the hump, created so many marquee playoff matchups, so many interesting conference championship moments, they won pretty much every Super Bowl as a conference from like the mid 80s till about 97, which is incredible. You had so many games like 49ers Giants, which was the end of the Montana era. Cowboys 49ers had numerous NFC championship games against each other. You had
especially that 49ers and Giants game in the 2011 NFC Championship. We have a good history with the 49ers and Giants when it comes to the NFC Championship. The first NFC Championship was an upset against either was the end of an era for Joe Montana and that offense. I still won't forget that memory, and I still love that 49ers and Giants rivalry till that day. You had Lawrence Taylor still in his prime. You have Phil Simms in his rookie seat still doing great, and top it all off, Jeff Hostetler was the only quarterback to beat the 49ers and the potential defensive Bills, thanks to that wide right play. That's the same situation what Tyler Loop did against the Steelers. Wide right. Tyler Bass, wide right. Now, I'm not trying to hurt any Bills fans out there, but I'm speaking facts about that. At the same time, the Buffalo Bills has been nothing more than playoff heartbreak and nothing more of a Buffalo Bills has been nothing more than a playoff heartbreak and a groundhog playoff team. And by groundhog playoff team, I'm talking about every time they make the playoffs, it's a one and done situation. It's a one and done situation against the Chiefs every time. It's a one and done situation with the Bengals, and it's a one and done situation with almost every team they faced, except for the 90s though. That's why I said the Buffalo Bills are a groundhog playoff team, is because the fact that they can't get past the AFC Championship ever since they made it last year. So if they don't get the job done, the Groundhog Day prophecy will be fulfilled.
And it's interesting you brought up great rivalries. I feel like there's several that come to mind, in part because of their history in the playoffs. The greatest interdivision rivalry in NFL history was Cowboys and 49ers through the 80s and 90s, mainly because of the repeated playoff clashes. First with Montana versus the Cowboys, then the Young and Aikman clashes. The greatest inter-conference rivalry in the NFL is the Steelers and Cowboys, who met in the Super Bowl numerous times throughout the years. And the greatest player rivalry, Tom Brady versus Peyton Manning, both regular season and AFC Championship game clashes alike.
if you want to name greatest quarterback rivalries, you mentioned the Cowboys versus the 49ers. You think of Roger Staubach, Joe Montana, Steve Young, Troy Aikman, Dak Prescott, uh, Brock, Dak Prescott, Brock Purdy. You could name Dak Prescott versus. I forgot that quarterback before Brock Purdy. Who was it again?
Jimmy G.
Yeah, Jimmy Garoppolo. Jimmy Garoppolo versus Dak Prescott. Eli Manning versus Tom Brady. I could also name Eli Manning versus Aaron Rodgers. That was a good playoff rivalry between those two. And to top it all off, I think, in my perspective, if they continue to play their cards right, in terms of the 49ers, they got a shot to go back. But speaking of going back, I don't think the Texans might go back to the AFC Championship. Consider, yes, you may have gone to AFC Championship a couple times with Warren Moon when he was on the Oilers, but I don't see that happening. So the teams I got coming out of the wild card we mentioned earlier is the 49ers.
Great rivalry that just came to mind playoff wise. 70 Steel Curtain versus the Raiders. John Madden, Ken Stabler, and that vicious Raiders defense versus that vicious Steel Curtain defense.
God bless the dead for Franco Harris, because he's one of the best running backs in the 70s alongside Bo Jackson. Bo Jackson was one of the fastest receivers in the league. If you remember correct, the best running backs in the playoffs, you think of Saquon Barkley, you think of Bo Jackson, you think of Marshall Faulk, you think of Hakeem Nicks, you think of O.J. Anderson. You think of O.J. Anderson. You think of almost every single running back. And I said O.J. Anderson because the fact that he was part of that 86 and 1990 Super Bowl team with the Giants. But I think that whole season with the Giants in the 90s and 80s, by the way, this year celebrates 40 years of 1986 when the Giants beat the Broncos with Lawrence Taylor and Phil Simms in their primes. We had a lot of things happening in that year. And ultimately, yes, I'm going to say it, this year marks 30 years of the Green Bay Packers beating the New England Patriots back in 96, which, by the way, Brett Favre that year was amazing. Brett Favre was amazing, was amazing that year. If only Sterling Sharp didn't broke his neck, he would have been a Super Bowl champion.
And we were robbed of that Sharp versus Sharp opportunity the following year when the Packers did end up making it back versus the Denver Broncos, the three-headed tier Elway, TD, Terrell Davis, and Shannon Sharp.
I still love Shannon Sharp because of the fact, not because of his hot takes with First Take or Undisputed with Skip Bayless, but he is one of the few great tight ends I love the most as a Giant fan, despite the fact they did beat us in that 2001 Super Bowl when he was on the Ravens. But in my opinion, Sterling Sharp is the better brother than Shannon Sharp still. If I had to choose the best brothers between, if you want to talk about football brothers, you talk about Eli, Peyton Manning, Sterling, Shannon Sharp, or you could name Joey or Nick Bosa. I think the best brother, or better yet, Travis and Jason Kelce. By the way, I feel bad for Jason Kelce because I wish he had one more year with the Eagles. If he didn't retire in that last year and before that 2023 late season collapse completion, you guys would have had another Super Bowl ring with Jason Kelce.
Hey, if they would have gotten Kellen Moore as a signal caller 1 year sooner, maybe it would have happened with Jason Kelce retiring on top. But it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes
in my perspective, when it comes to playoff teams, like I mentioned earlier, the Eagles and Giants, right? They're one of the one of the few historic rivals in the NFC East, especially in that Miracle in Meadowlands situations. You know which games I'm talking about.
The original.
The original Miracle on Meadowlands. that one blowout game against the Eagles in the division, which, by the way, Daniel Jones could have done better before he got extended. And I think the Eagles offense looks very sluggish. I said it from time and time again, and I said you vouch for a rat. If you continue to play like this on playoff time, cut him, fire him, and send him into the incinerator.
Yeah, but hey, man, there's been a lot of interesting rivalries, a lot of memorable moments throughout the playoff history, like the Minneapolis Miracle, the helmet catch, 4th and 26.
Oh yeah, that
Rodgers
Manningham
double
catch
Hail
too.
Mary.
You forgot the Manningham catch too. That Manningham catch against the Patriots. That was amazing. And there is one
Beastquake. So many.
Yep. But the one specific thing everyone loves to talk about is that comeback in the Super Bowl between the Falcons and the Patriots. That was one of the greatest Super Bowl comebacks in any playoff history. We've seen comebacks before in the playoffs. We've seen the Bills coming back against the Oilers. We've seen the Vikings coming back against the Saints. And we've seen the Patriots coming back after leading 28-3 with Dan Quinn and Kyle Shanahan. I don't know why, but if they played their card, if the Falcons would have never choked that 28-3 lead, they would have been Super Bowl champions. They could have had a Super Bowl against the they could have went to the had a Super Bowl champion in the 90s, but ultimately they messed up. They messed up big time. They messed up against the Broncos and they messed up against the Patriots, which, in my opinion, the Falcons are one of the worst teams in football in the NFC South. Which, by the way, speaking of the Falcons, I'm glad you predicted it, saying that Rashid Morris should go. You didn't mention the general manager too. Bless you. You didn't mention the GM too.
The GM, you also point back to that botched 2024 offseason, particularly how they handled quarterback situation, signing Cousins to a starter contract only to draft Michael Penix, who had a big injury history. It put them in that hole where all of a sudden they decide to bench Cousins while they still have a shot to make a playoff push for an inexperienced quarterback. Then they start Penix the next year, only for him to get hurt and Cousins to come in and make them competitive and make their record look better than it truly was. That may have potentially cost them the playoffs this season. That puts them in a long-term hole. Cousins isn't getting any younger, and Penix, you don't know with his injury history, even going back to college.
You don't know if Michael Penix Jr. is the long-term answer, period. If you want to scout a really good quarterback, which this year, by the way, is one of the weakest draft class for quarterback situations, try to look up Ty Simpson or Dante Moore or Fernando Mendoza. By the way, he's going to the Raiders. I really hope for their own sake they don't treat him like Jamarcus Russell did.
Yeah, oh my goodness. Well, at least if Mendoza at least bothers to pick up a playbook, he'll at least be better than Jamarcus Russell.
Hey, Jackson Dart at least did something this whole season. He had over 22 touchdowns and had 5 or less interceptions. He has over 2,000 yards, and this is without his receivers, by the way, and Cam Scatterbo while he was at it. If you look at it on paper with Jackson Dart, Cam Ward, Tyler Shugg, and Jackson Dart are my top 3 quarterbacks of this year's draft class. Tyler Shugg at number 1, Cam Ward at number 2, Jackson Dart at 3. Which, by the way, Tyler Shugg has more wins than Jackson Dart. I'm not being biased about it, but it's true. Jackson Dart has more passing yards than Tyler Shugg, if I'm not mistaken. Passing touchdowns than, if I'm not mistaken. And Cam Ward, if he can get the right pieces, you have a shot to win the AFC South, which I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Now, for the Eagles, I say this. The outcome of the 49ers game will ultimately determine whether they made the right or wrong call resting their starters in the final week of the season, because ultimately they could have had the number 2 seed if they played their starters and beat Washington. I mean, Washington barely beat them with their backups. They could have easily won with their starters, possibly gotten the number 2 seed in the Packers, which if the Eagles lose this game, they'll look like fools for resting their starters in that final game.
Which I agree with you, Nikki. And by the way, did I also mention about head coaches after Black Monday? I think the Giants with John Harbaugh should be the perfect fit for the Giants, and I'll explain why. John Harbaugh, during his 18-year tenure with the Baltimore Ravens, has got them multiple winning seasons. They got into multiple division champions with the AFC North. He has made at least a few AFC championships, won a Super Bowl against the 49ers game, which, by the way, it was called the blackout game in New Orleans. Ultimately, for John Harbaugh to win the Super Bowl and Ray Lewis retiring as a champion. He can help Jackson Dart develop with Scatterboo and Neighbors coming back. If you draft a receiver, good. You draft a receiver in that specific situation and you get the right pieces to go with, you have a shot to win the NFC East, which I mentioned it earlier. But now I'm going to look over it now. The Giants, Falcons, and Raiders are the three candidates for John Harbaugh. But ultimately, the Giants are the heavy favorites. If they along with Kevin Stefanski potentially being the head coach, I don't see that happening. That's the mistake we made back in 2019 with Pat Shurmur, which, by the way, Pat Shurmur was horrible during that Giants offense with Daniel Jones after Eli Manning was benched for whatever reason. But I think if John Harbaugh goes to the Giants and you hire the right pieces in terms of the offensive defensive coordinator, you got a shot. You got a shot to compete with the Eagles. And you got a shot to go to the playoffs. Which, by the way, if this actually happens, I would love to see the Giants and Eagles rivalry for years to come with Jackson Dart versus Jalen Hurts.
And you know what? Really, just that NFC East as a whole being a better division is great for the NFL, too. If you have the Giants, Eagles, or any Cowboys, especially those three teams, all being in the mix, usually that's good for NFL's ratings with three big market cities all competing. We saw it in the 2000s when you had those teams with McNabb, Romo,
you have the teams
Eli
with John
Manning.
McNabb, Eli Manning, Tony Romo, and I forgot who the quarterback was for the Redskins, by the way.
Oh, they altered between different quarterbacks that era. It was like Jason Campbell,
I don't know who that is, but ultimately,
Mark Brunell.
Mark Brunell. You can name every quarterback in the early 2000s before RG3. But in my perspective, this decade was nothing more than Cowboys and Eagles. In the NFC East for years to come, I feel like the NFC East is going to be wide open for years to come. It's either going to be the Giants, the Commanders got a good future in terms of Jaden Daniels, but considering how they did with Cliff Kingsbury was very questionable. But I'm not going to waste further time because I think we went over an hour and 8 minutes. But I think for the final hot take, the Giants will hire John Harbaugh before one of the playoff games starts. If they do this right, they will have to pray for the best and say Joe Schoen did his part. Until then, guys, thank you all for watching. I'm your co-host, Agent Warrior X, with Nikki Steves. See you all in the playoffs. Until next time, goodbye, my friends. Have a great night, everyone.
Have a great night. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, peace. May the NFL playoffs bring more great memories.